Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a journey back in time, not to mighty battles or grand castles, but right into the very kitchens and dining halls of the Middle Ages. Close your eyes for a moment and picture it. You're walking through a smoky, bustling medieval town. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and something else. Something that smells vaguely of stale cabbage and unidentifiable meat. You pass by a grimy stall where a vendor is hawking what looks suspiciously like a blackened, lumpy sausage. You feel a sudden pang of hunger and then a wave of nausea because you quickly realize that you're modern, discerning palate and likely your stomach probably won't survive this trip. Seriously, what these folks considered a good meal might make your digestive system stage a full-scale revolt. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening, drop a comment with your location and local time. It's always wild to see where everyone's tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing in a rather cramped, dark dwelling, typical of a medieval peasant's home. The air is damp, and the only light comes from a small sputtering fire in the hearth. The smell, you've quickly learned, is a constant companion. What immediately strikes you, if you were to peer into the humble larder, is the sheer, overwhelming presence of grain. It's everywhere, sacks of it, sheaves of it, and the ever-present, sometimes slightly mouldy, loaves of bread. You see, for the vast majority of medieval society, especially the serfs and common folk, bread wasn't just part of the meal. It was the meal. It was the backbone, the filler, the utensil, and sometimes the only thing standing between you and gnawing hunger. Imagine your daily life revolving around the harvest. From dawn till dusk, you're toiling in the fields, your hands calloused, your back aching. And what fuels this relentless labor? Most likely, it's a coarse, dark loaf of bread, probably made from rye or barley, perhaps mixed with a bit of oats. This isn't your artisanal sourdough or fluffy white sliced bread. Oh no, this is heavy, dense, and often quite tough. It's designed to fill you up and stay with you, providing the slow release energy needed for a day of backbreaking work. It's often baked in communal ovens, a social ritual in itself, where everyone brings their dough and waits for their turn. This shared baking process was a huge part of community life, a place where gossip was exchanged and friendships forged, all centered around the creation of this vital foodstuff. One of the more fascinating and frankly a bit disturbing quirks of medieval bread was its occasional role beyond mere sustenance. You might find yourself eating a trencher. No, not a trench of bread, but a trencher, which was literally a thick slice of stale bread used as a plate. You'd pile your meager stew or vegetables onto it, letting the bread soak up the juices, and then, when you were done, you'd either eat the soggy trencher or, more often, give it to your dog or the poor. Talk about zero waste. It's an ingenious, if not entirely appetizing, solution to the lack of proper dinnerware, and historians still argue whether the primary reason for trenchers was truly economic saving on pottery, if it was a deliberate culinary choice to enhance the meal's flavors. The sheer volume of grain consumed was staggering. An average medieval person might consume several pounds of bread a day. Think about that for a second. That's a lot of carbs, even for someone doing intense manual labor. And while wheat was preferred, especially for the more affluent, it was often too expensive for the common person. So, rye, barley, and oats became the staples, sometimes mixed with legumes like peas or beans to stretch the flour further. The quality of your bread was often a direct indicator of your social standing. The finer, whiter bread, made from sifted wheat flour, was reserved for the nobility and the clergy, a symbol of their elevated status. Your bread, my friend, is probably a dark, hearty, and somewhat gritty affair, full of bran and whatever other bits snuck in during the milling process. You might even find the occasional pebble or insect, adding an unexpected crunch. Just a little extra protein, right? This focus on grain meant that agricultural failures, like a bad harvest, were utterly catastrophic. Without the grain, there was no bread, and without bread, there was widespread famine. You can imagine the constant anxiety that must have permeated medieval life, knowing that your very survival hinged on the whims of the weather and the fertility of the land. It made every harvest a moment of profound relief, a temporary reprieve from the ever-present threat of starvation. And yet, despite the simplicity, this reliance on bread fostered a deep connection to the land and the cycles of nature, a connection we've largely lost in our modern world of endless supermarket aisles. As your journey through time continues, shifting from the medieval peasant's humble kitchen, you suddenly find yourself standing on a vast open field, the air crisp and cold, filled not with market chatter, but with the distant murmur of thousands of men. You are no longer in a bustling town, but on the cusp of a medieval battlefield. And let me tell you, you probably won't survive this. What you're witnessing now is the often overlooked, yet utterly fundamental process of assembling the medieval army. It's less like a modern military draft and more like herding cats. Very dangerous, armored cats. Imagine trying to gather an army in the Middle Ages. There was no single unified national force. Instead, a medieval army was a patchwork quilt of diverse, often reluctant, components, each with its own motivations and loyalties. At its core, you'd have the feudal levy, knights and nobles bound by oaths to their lord, the king, or a powerful duke, who would bring their own retinues of armed men. These were the professional warriors, equipped with the best armor and weapons, forming the heavy cavalry, the elite of the army. Imagine a small group of highly trained, heavily armed individuals, each with their own personal banner, arriving with their own men-at-arms. Then came the mercenaries. These were professional soldiers who fought for pay, hired for their specific skills, perhaps skilled archers from Wales, crossbowmen from Genoa, or pikemen from Flanders. They were reliable, often highly effective, but also expensive and notoriously fickle, liable to switch sides if a better offer came along or if their pay was late. You might see grizzled veterans with a hardened look, their gear bearing the marks of many campaigns, looking far more disciplined than the local levies. A mainstream historical fact is the increasing reliance on mercenaries in the later medieval period, as feudal levies became less reliable for prolonged campaigns. Kings found it more practical and efficient to hire professional soldiers who could be kept in the field longer and who were trained for specific military roles, rather than relying on vassals who had limited service obligation. This shift marked a significant evolution in medieval military organization. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about army assembly, the array or general call to arm. Sometimes, especially in times of great national emergency, a king might issue a general call, requiring all able-bodied men of a certain age to report for duty. These were often untrained peasants, equipped with whatever farm tools could be adapted into weapons, a pitchfork, a sharpened scythe, or a simple club. Imagine a motley crew, bewildered and terrified, suddenly thrust into the role of soldiers, their only motivation being compulsion and the fear of their lord's wrath. It makes you realize that medieval armies weren't always the shining forces of legend. Historians still argue whether the effectiveness of these peasant levies was negligible in open battle, or if their sheer numbers and desperate courage could sometimes provide a crucial, if disorganized, mass. Beyond these main groups, you'd also find support personnel, blacksmiths to repair armor and weapons, fletchers to make arrows, cooks to prepare food, a massive undertaking for thousands of men, priests to offer spiritual guidance and perhaps last rites, and even camp followers, merchants, prostitutes, and others seeking opportunity or simply following their livelihood. A medieval army was a self-contained, albeit crude, moving city. Logistics were a nightmare. Gathering these disparate groups, supplying them with food, water, and equipment, and maintaining discipline among men who might speak different languages and owe allegiance to different lords was a constant struggle. Desertion was common, especially among the less enthusiastic levies, and disease could decimate ranks even before a battle was fought. So, as you observe this vast, disparate collection of humanity slowly coalescing, from the proud knights to the reluctant peasants and the pragmatic mercenaries, you begin to grasp the monumental effort required just to put a medieval army on the field. It's a messy, chaotic, and utterly human endeavor, far removed from the tidy lines of history books. And you're starting to understand why battles were so often decided not just by courage, but by the sheer grinding effort of getting there. From the chaotic assembly of diverse fighting forces, your journey now follows the army as it begins its long, grueling progression. You are witnessing the march to war, an experience far removed from any modern military parade. This wasn't a quick hop to the front lines. It was an arduous, slow, and often miserable pilgrimage across the medieval landscape, fraught with challenges that could weaken an army long before it ever saw an enemy. Imagine setting out with thousands of men, horses, and wagons. The pace would be agonizingly slow. Medieval roads were little more than dirt tracks, often churned into deep mud by rain or raising choking clouds of dust in dry weather. Bridges were rare, so rivers often meant lengthy detours or dangerous fording. Each day would be a relentless slog, covering perhaps 10 to 15 miles at best. Try walking for days on end in heavy woolens, carrying your gear with only the promise of more walking tomorrow. It sounds like a truly miserable hiking trip, doesn't it? The logistics of feeding such a massive force were a constant nightmare. An army of 10, 0 men and their accompanying horses would consume vast quantities of food and fodder daily. This meant either extensive foraging, which could alienate local populations and turn them into enemies, or relying on a painstakingly slow supply chain of wagons carrying provisions. Imagine the stench and chaos of 1,000 men trying to relieve themselves in the bushes around a temporary camp, or the arguments over dwindling rations. Discipline, already tenuous, would often break down under the strain. A mainstream historical fact is the significant impact of disease and desertion during marches. Far more soldiers often died from illness, dysentery, typhus, camp fever, or simply abandoned the army due to hardship and hunger than from actual combat. An army could lose a quarter or even a third of its strength on the march before ever reaching the battlefield, making effective logistical planning as crucial as military strategy. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about medieval army life on the march, the presence of camp followers. Medieval armies were often accompanied by a sprawling, unofficial retinue of non-combatants, merchants selling goods, prostitutes, wives and families of soldiers, beggars, and various opportunists. Imagine thousands of soldiers, but then thousands more civilians, swelling the ranks, creating an even larger, more unwieldy mass to manage. While they provided services, they also consumed resources and added to the logistical burden, making the march even more chaotic. Historians still argue whether camp followers were a necessary evil for medieval armies, providing services and morale, or if they were primarily a drain on resources and a hindrance to efficient movement. Nightfall brought a temporary respite, but not much comfort. Armies would typically set up crude camps, often without proper shelter, especially for the lower ranks. Fires would be lit for warmth and cooking, casting flickering shadows across the weary faces. Sentries would be posted, guarding against enemy patrols or internal unrest. Sleep would be fitful, broken by the sounds of the camp and the constant vigilance. The psychological toll of the march was immense. Boredom, fear, hunger, and discomfort were constant companions. Morale could plummet, leading to grumbling, insubordination, or outright mutiny. Commanders constantly had to balance the need to press forward with the need to maintain their army's cohesion. It was a brutal test of endurance for everyone involved, from the armored knight to the foot soldier trudging beside his cart. So, as you trudge through the mud, feeling the aches in your joints and the gnawing of hunger, you realize that the march to a medieval battle was a formidable challenge in itself. It was a test of resilience, a struggle against the elements and internal dissent that often shaped the outcome of the battle long before the first sword was ever drawn. You'd certainly appreciate a comfortable bed and a hot meal after even a single day of this medieval commute. Leaving the muddy, weary columns of the marching army, your perspective now shifts, as if soaring above the landscape to a critical juncture before any steel is truly drawn. Choosing the battlefield. Forget simply lining up and fighting. In medieval warfare, the terrain itself was often the most formidable or most advantageous. weapon. You'd quickly realize that a shrewd commander could win half the battle before the first arrow flew, simply by picking the right patch of ground. Imagine two opposing armies, having marched for days, finally within sight of each other. The commanders, often accompanied by their most trusted knights and scouts, would spend hours, sometimes even days, meticulously examining the surrounding landscape. They weren't looking for a flat open field for a fair fight. They were looking for every possible advantage, every ditch, every hillock, every patch of forest that could be turned to their benefit. It was a high-stakes game of tactical chess, played out on the actual earth. A commander might seek high ground, knowing it would give his archers a better range and his cavalry more momentum. A marshy flank could protect a vulnerable wing, forcing the enemy to attack through difficult terrain. A dense wood could offer cover for an ambush or provide a safe retreat. Rivers, ravines, and even thick hedges could be turned into formidable defensive barriers. You might see generals pointing, gesturing, and sending out small scouting parties to investigate every undulation of the land, knowing a tiny slope could decide the fate of thousands. A mainstream historical fact is the profound impact of terrain on famous medieval battles. The Battle of Agincourt, 1415, for instance, saw the English longbowmen devastate a much larger French army, partly because the French were forced to advance across a narrow, muddy plain, bottlenecking their superior numbers and making them easy targets. Similarly, the Battle of Hastings, 1066, was heavily influenced by the English holding a defensible ridge. These weren't coincidences, they were deliberate tactical choices that leveraged the landscape. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about battlefield selection, the use of sacred sites. Sometimes the choice of battlefield wasn't purely tactical. Battles might intentionally be fought near holy sites, churches, or places believed to be divinely favored. This wasn't necessarily for a tactical advantage, but rather to invoke divine assistance, boost the morale of one's own troops, or perhaps demoralize a pious enemy. Imagine a commander choosing a spot not because it's good for defense, but because he believes a saint's blessing will guarantee victory. It's a fascinating blend of military pragmatism and medieval spiritual belief. Historians still argue whether the choice of sacred sites for battle was primarily a genuine religious motivation, a psychological tactic, or a convenient justification for a militarily sound location. Beyond the natural features, commanders would also consider where their supply lines would run, how they could establish a secure camp, and where they could draw water. The ground itself mattered. Firm ground was essential for cavalry charges, while soft, boggy terrain could trap heavily armored knights, turning them into helpless targets. As the French discovered at Agincourt, the psychological aspect of battlefield selection was also key. Deploying on commanding ground or in a position that forced the enemy into a disadvantageous attack could significantly impact the morale of both armies before the first blow was struck. A strong defensive position could instill confidence in your own weary troops and sow doubt in the hearts of the attacking force. So, as you watch the commanders intently studying the land, sending out patrols, and meticulously arraying their forces, you realize that the medieval battlefield was a living, breathing entity, its contours and features dictating the flow of destiny. It was a stark reminder that in an age of limited technology, the earth itself was a powerful, silent participant in the brutal dance of war. You'd certainly appreciate satellite imagery and topographical maps after seeing this painstaking on-the-ground reconnaissance. From the careful strategic selection of the battlefield, your perspective now narrows, bringing you directly to the field itself. In the moments just before the storm, you were experiencing dawn on the battlefield, a tense, often lengthy, and psychologically grueling period of preparation that tested the nerves of every man before the first blow was even struck. You'd quickly realize that the waiting could be almost as terrifying as the fighting. Imagine the breaking dawn. The cold, pre-dawn mist clings to the ground, obscuring the enemy army across the field. You can hear the sounds of thousands of men stirring, the muffled clatter of armor, the snorts of horses, the distant shouts of commands echoing across the field. Fires, perhaps lit hours ago, are now dying embers, casting a faint reddish glow on the faces of your comrades. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and the nervous smell of men and horses. This isn't a swift, decisive move. It's a prolonged, agonizing prelude to violence. Commanders would spend these vital hours meticulously arraying their troop. The heavy infantry, often pikemen or spearmen, would form dense blocks in the center, their long weapons bristling forward like a hedgehog. Archers, with their formidable longbows or crossbows, would be positioned on the flanks, or sometimes in front, ready to unleash their devastating volleys. The elite heavy cavalry, the knights, would usually be held in reserve, or positioned on the wings, ready for a decisive charge or to counter an enemy breakthrough. Every man would be assigned his specific place, a cog in a vast, unwieldy machine. A mainstream historical fact is the meticulous and often time-consuming process of deploying medieval armies into battle formations. This wasn't a quick affair. It could take hours for thousands of men to move into their designated positions, especially if the terrain was difficult or if one army was trying to gain a tactical advantage by shifting its lines. This slow deployment was a critical vulnerability, as a surprise attack during this phase could be devastating. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about these tense pre-battle moments, the ritual of feasting or eating a last meal. While it sounds contradictory given the tension, many medieval soldiers, particularly knights, would eat a substantial meal before battle. This wasn't just for sustenance, it was a psychological ritual. It symbolized a defiance of death, a communion with comrades, and an attempt to calm nerves. Imagine trying to force down a heavy meal of bread and salted meat, knowing that in a few hours you might be fighting for your life. It's a grim, yet oddly human tradition. Historians still argue whether this pre-battle meal was primarily for practical energy, for morale, or if it was a formalized ritual rooted in religious or cultural beliefs about preparing for death. The psychological pressure would be immense. Hours of waiting, staring across the field at the enemy, listening to the sounds of their preparations, knowing that any moment could be your last. Fear, determination, and a grim resignation would mingle in the rank. Priests would move among the soldiers, offering blessings and hearing confessions, providing spiritual comfort in the face of imminent death. The anticipation itself was a weapon, slowly grinding down the nerves of the less experienced. Sometimes there would be attempts at last-minute negotiations, though these rarely succeeded. More often, it was a silent standoff, each side waiting for the other to make the first move, or for the morning mist to burn off, revealing the full scale of the impending clash. The cold would seep into your armor, and your hands would likely be clammy despite the chill. So, as you stand there, weapon gripped tightly, listening to the rhythmic drum of your own heart and the distant murmurs of the enemy, you understand that dawn on a medieval battlefield was a test of courage before the fighting even began. It was a prolonged moment of reckoning, where fear and resolve battled it out in the quiet hours before the storm broke. You'd certainly appreciate a quick morning coffee and a less life-threatening commute after this experience. From the tense, silent standoff of dawn on the battlefield, the air suddenly cracks with sound, a terrifying crescendo that announces the beginning of the horror. You are now experiencing the initial onslaught, archer volleys and first blood. Forget polite exchanges of fire. This was a merciless rain of death, designed to break enemy formations and shatter morale long before close combat. You'd quickly realize that arrows found their mark with brutal efficiency. Imagine the command ringing out, "Archers, draw." Thousands of men, perhaps positioned on a slight rise, knocked their arrows. For the English, the famous longbowmen. For other armies, crossbowmen or composite archers. There's a moment of unsettling silence, then the distinct twang of thousands of bowstrings. The sky above you darkens, not with clouds, but with a vast undulating swarm of arrows, arcing high into the air. The sound as they descend is chilling, a whistling whisper that quickly turns into a deadly hum, then a thudding rain on shields, armor, and flesh. The sheer volume of arrows fired was staggering. A skilled longbowman could loose 10-12 arrows a minute. Multiply that by thousands of archers, and you have a storm of deadly projectiles designed to fall indiscriminately onto the enemy ranks. They didn't aim for specific individuals, but for the densest part of the formation, knowing that at that range, every arrow was likely to hit something. and hit they did. A mainstream historical fact is the devastating effectiveness of massed archery, particularly the English longbow, in breaking up enemy formations and causing heavy casualties before the main lines even engaged. Battles like Crécy and Agincourt became famous for the longbow's ability to decimate enemy cavalry and infantry, especially when combined with advantageous terrain that channeled the enemy into the arrow's killing zone. Now for a rather quirky tidbit about arrow design, the variety of arrowheads. These weren't just simple pointed tips. Medieval fletchers crafted a horrifying array of arrowheads for different purposes. Bodkin points, sharp and narrow, were designed to pierce plate armor. Broadheads, wide and flat, caused maximum tissue damage, creating gaping wounds. Barbed arrows were designed to stick in flesh, making them incredibly difficult and painful to remove. Imagine facing a volley where each arrow was specifically engineered for maximum lethality against different targets. It's a terrifying testament to medieval engineering. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of specialized arrowheads was truly effective against all types of armor, or if their variety was more about psychological impact and versatility against mixed enemy forces. The immediate impact of an arrow volley was chaos. Men would fall screaming as arrows pierced their flimsy armor or found gaps in their defenses. Horses, maddened by pain and fear, would rear and buck, throwing their riders. Formations so meticulously arranged just moments before would begin to break apart, gaps appearing as men tried to avoid the deadly rain. Morale would plummet for those exposed to this unrelenting barrage. The ground quickly became littered with fallen men and horses, a grim testament to the archers' work. The air would fill with the stench of fear, blood, and the metallic tang of fresh wounds. For those who survived the initial volleys, the psychological toll would be immense, knowing that another storm of death could descend at any moment. Your ears would be ringing, and your heart pounding a frantic rhythm. So, as you hear the whistle of the arrows and the dull thud as they find their mark, you realize that the medieval battlefield opened not with a shout, but with a deadly silent rain. It was a terrifying prelude to the close quarters horrors, designed to weaken, demoralize, and thin the enemy ranks before the real fighting even began. You'd certainly appreciate a simple umbrella after this, though it wouldn't do you much good here. From the terrifying, indiscriminate hail of arrows, your perspective now shifts, plunging you into the heart of the action as the ground begins to tremble. You are now experiencing the cavalry charge, the thunderous, visually magnificent, yet often chaotic and surprisingly disrupted attack of mounted knights. Forget the perfectly synchronized lines you see in movies. This was a powerful but often fragile spearhead designed to shatter enemy formation. Imagine standing on the field. The ground begins to vibrate underfoot, a low rumble that grows rapidly into a pounding thunder. Across the field you see a magnificent, terrifying sight. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of armored knights on powerful war horses, their lances lowered, thundering towards you. The sun glints off their polished armor, and their banners stream behind them. The sound is deafening, the rhythmic drumming of hooves, the snorting of horses, and the shouts of the riders. It's a truly awe-inspiring and utterly terrifying spectacle designed to instill fear and break morale even before impact. The goal of the cavalry charge was to punch a hole through the enemy lines, to shatter their cohesion, and to sow panic. The sheer weight and momentum of armored horses and riders, combined with the psychological impact, could be devastating against unprepared infantry. Knights would aim their lances at gaps in the enemy formation, hoping to splinter the shield wall and create a breach for the following waves of cavalry or infantry. A mainstream historical fact is the immense psychological impact of a heavy cavalry charge. Even if the charge itself didn't always break the enemy's lines, the fear it instilled and the pressure it exerted often forced infantry to break formation, creating vulnerabilities that could then be exploited by other elements of the army. It was a potent psychological weapon as much as a physical one, often causing panicked routs before contact was even made. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about the cavalry charge's reality, its susceptibility to terrain and obstacles. Despite their power, cavalry charges were surprisingly easy to disrupt. Hidden ditches, muddy ground, strategically placed stakes, or even dense formations of disciplined pikemen could bring a thundering charge to a grinding halt. Imagine galloping full tilt, only for your horse to stumble into an unseen ditch, sending you sprawling in your heavy armor, a helpless target for enemy foot soldiers. It highlights how quickly the glorious charge could devolve into a chaotic, vulnerable mess. Historians still argue whether the decline in the effectiveness of heavy cavalry in the later medieval period was primarily due to improved infantry tactics and anti-cavalry defenses, or if it was simply a more consistent understanding of cavalry's inherent vulnerabilities. The initial impact, if successful, was brutal. Horses would crash into the enemy lines, lances would splinter, and men would be knocked aside like skittles. But the charge rarely maintained its momentum for long. Horses would shy away from the dense infantry, the ground would become uneven with bodies, and the knights themselves would become bogged down in hand-to-hand combat, their lances often broken after a single use, forcing them to draw swords or maces. The disciplined formation would quickly dissolve into individual melees. The noise would be unbearable. The screams of men and horses, the clang of steel, the grunts of exertion. For those caught in the path of the charge, it was a moment of pure terror and desperate struggle for survival. For the knights, the challenge was to maintain their cohesion and to avoid being isolated and unhorsed, a deadly prospect in the chaos. So, as you feel the earth shake and see the magnificent yet fragile wave of cavalry bearing down, you realize that the medieval cavalry charge was a powerful, often decisive, but inherently unpredictable moment in battle. It was a terrifying gamble where a split-second miscalculation or an unseen obstacle could turn a glorious advance into a deadly tangle. You'd certainly appreciate a seatbelt or perhaps just a very sturdy wall after witnessing that. From the thunderous, yet often disrupted, charge of the cavalry, your senses are now assaulted by the true, grinding horror of medieval combat. You are deep within the infantry clash, the brutal, exhausting, hand-to-hand struggle where the vast majority of soldiers fought and died. Forget choreographed duels. This was a chaotic, crushing, and terrifying melee. You'd quickly realize that personal skill was often secondary to sheer endurance and the desperate will to survive. Imagine yourself in the thick of it. The lines of infantry, perhaps shield walls or dense blocks of spearmen, meet with a sickening crunch. The air immediately fills with the clang of steel, the shouts of men, the guttural grunts of exertion, and the screams of the wounded. There's no clear space. You're pressed in on all sides by your comrades and by the enemy. Every swing of a weapon is hampered by the crush of bodies. You're constantly pushing, shoving, and struggling to maintain your footing on ground that quickly becomes slippery with mud and blood. The fighting is not about elegant swordplay, but about brute force and opportunity. You don't have room for fancy maneuvers. It's a series of desperate thrusts, hacking blows, and desperate parries. Your aim is to find any gap in an opponent's armor, to trip them, or simply to wear them down through relentless pressure. The noise is overwhelming, a cacophony of metal on metal, splintering wood, and the cries of men. It's a terrifying sensory overload that would utterly disorient your modern mind. A mainstream historical fact about infantry combat is the importance of the shield wall or pike block as a defensive formation. These dense, disciplined formations, where men stood shoulder to shoulder with overlapping shields or bristling pikes, were incredibly difficult to break. They could absorb cavalry charges and grind down attacking infantry, proving that collective cohesion was often more powerful than individual prowess. Many famous battles saw these formations hold for hours against relentless assault. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about the intimate reality of the infantry clash, the smell of fear and bodily fluids. Beyond the metallic tang of blood, the battlefield reeked of sweat, urine, and excrement from frightened men and horses, combined with the coppery smell of freshly shed blood. Imagine fighting for your life, surrounded by these overwhelming primal odors, adding another layer to the psychological torment. It makes you realize just how utterly visceral and unpleasant medieval combat truly was, far beyond what any movie portrays. Historians still argue whether the psychological impact of these overwhelming battlefield smells contributed significantly to roots, or if soldiers simply became desensitized to them in the heat of battle. The fighting was continuous. There were no timeouts, no breaks. Exhaustion would set in quickly, as every swing, every push, every defensive maneuver demanded immense physical effort. Men would fight until they dropped, either from wounds, fatigue, or sheer terror. You might find yourself fighting over the bodies of fallen comrades, stepping on their limbs as you push forward or defend your ground. Visibility would be poor, obscured by dust, sweat, and perhaps the fluttering of banners. Identifying friend from foe could be a challenge, relying on shouted passwords or the colors on their tunics and shield. The terror of being overwhelmed, of having your formation collapse, would be a constant gnawing fear. And the knowledge that quarter was often not given to common soldiers added a desperate edge to every struggle. So, as you feel the crushing weight of bodies, hear the desperate cries, and experience the brutal claustrophobic reality of the infantry clash, you realize that medieval battle was a horrifying crucible. It was a test of sheer will, where survival hinged on a grim determination to keep fighting against overwhelming odds. You'd certainly appreciate a spacious, air-conditioned room and a quiet evening after even a few minutes of that. From the brutal, crushing reality of the infantry clash, your attention is now drawn to the instruments of that carnage, the weapons of war used in close combat. Forget the finely balanced artistic swords of fantasy. Medieval battlefield weapons were often heavy, blunt, and designed for one purpose: to deliver maximum damage against armored opponents in a chaotic melee. You'd quickly realize that these tools were built for brutality, not beauty. Imagine yourself gripping one of these weapons. The ubiquitous sword was the most iconic, but often not the most effective. While long swords and arming swords were common, they were primarily slashing and thrusting weapons. Against a heavily armored knight, a sword might be more useful for finding gaps or leveraging for a follow-up blow rather than delivering a decisive, crushing strike. Imagine the immense strength needed to wield a heavy longsword for hours, parrying blows and delivering powerful cuts in a sustained fight. More brutal and often more effective against armor were axes and maces. An axe, whether a single-handed battle axe or a heavy two-handed Dane axe, delivered tremendous cleaving power, capable of splitting shields, crushing helmets, and severing limbs. Maces, with their heavy, often flanged heads, were designed to deliver blunt force trauma, crushing armor and breaking bones beneath it. Imagine the bone-jarring impact of a mace blow. Even if it didn't pierce the armor, the internal injuries would be devastating. These were the tools of a grim butcher, designed to inflict maximum blunt force. A mainstream historical fact is the evolution of medieval weaponry in response to armor development. As plate armor became more effective in the later Middle Ages, simple swords became less decisive. This led to the increased use of blunt weapons like maces and hammers designed to inflict concussive damage, and specialized polearms, which we'll touch on later, that could hook, trip, or penetrate armor at specific points. It was an arms race, with offensive and defensive technologies constantly evolving in a brutal dance. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about less common, but equally terrifying, close combat weapons. The flail. While perhaps more commonly seen in fantasy, a medieval flail consisted of a handle connected by a chain to a spiked ball or a heavy, blunt head. Its design allowed it to bypass shields and parries, swinging unpredictably to deliver devastating blows. Imagine trying to defend against a weapon that could literally come at you from any angle, its heavy, spiked head designed to crush anything it touched. It's a terrifying, almost chaotic weapon. Historians still argue whether the flail was truly as widespread and effective on the battlefield as depicted in some sources, or if its complexity limited its common adoption by all but specialized warriors. Other close combat weapons included daggers, used for grappling and delivering fatal thrusts into armor gaps or vulnerable points. Spears, versatile for both thrusting and throwing, and various polearms, long weapons with a blade, axe head, or hammerhead mounted on a long shaft, like the halberd or poleaxe, designed to provide reach and devastating power against both infantry and cavalry. These polearms were particularly effective against armored knights, allowing foot soldiers to unhorse them or to strike at weak points. The weight and balance of these weapons would be immense, Wielding them for hours in the heat of battle, amidst the crush of bodies, would require incredible stamina and strength. They would quickly become slick with sweat and blood, making them difficult to grip. The sheer barbarity of these implements underscores the brutal reality of medieval combat. So, as you feel the imagined weight of a battle axe in your hands, or envision the bone-shattering impact of a mace, you realize that medieval weapons were crude, efficient tools of destruction. They were designed for raw power and grisly efficiency, making every engagement a matter of life and death, often decided by the most direct and brutal application of force. You'd certainly appreciate a gentle handshake after gripping one of those. From the brutal efficiency of medieval weapons, your attention now shifts to the protective layers that adorn the warriors wielding them: shields and armor. Forget the invincible gleaming suits of myth. Medieval defensive gear was a marvel of craftsmanship and protection, but it came with significant limitations in terms of mobility, comfort, and ultimately absolute invulnerability. You'd quickly realize that being a walking tank had its downside. Imagine yourself encased in medieval armor. In the early medieval period, this might be a simple leather jerkin or a tunic, reinforced with small metal plates. As the centuries progressed, armor became increasingly sophisticated. For a knight, you'd likely be wearing chainmail, a complex garment made of thousands of interlinked metal rings. This offered excellent protection against cuts and slashes, but less so against crushing blows or direct stabs from pointed weapons like bodkin arrows. Imagine the sheer weight of it, perhaps 30-40 pounds, clinking and chafing with every movement. And trying to get a good night's sleep in it? Forget it. By the late medieval period, plate armor emerged, representing the pinnacle of defensive technology. This involved large, custom-fitted pieces of hardened steel, articulated at the joints, providing almost full-body protection. A full suit of plate armor could weigh anywhere from 45 to 60 pounds, distributed over the body. While incredibly protective against most weapons, it wasn't impenetrable. Gaps at the joints, visor openings, and the sheer concussive force of heavy blows could still be deadly. Imagine the claustrophobia of being sealed inside a metal shell, your vision limited to a narrow slit, your hearing muffled. A mainstream historical fact is that full plate armor, despite its weight, allowed for surprising mobility. Contrary to popular myth, a knight in full plate armor could mount a horse, run, and even get up if knocked down. The weight was distributed evenly across the body, similar to a modern soldier carrying a heavy pack, and the articulation was designed to allow movement, not restrict it entirely. It still required immense strength and stamina, of course, but it wasn't the immovable prison often portrayed. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about armor and battlefield realities: the problem of overheating. While metal armor provided protection from weapons, it offered almost no ventilation. Fighting vigorously in heavy armor, especially on a hot day or under direct sun, could quickly lead to severe heat exhaustion and dehydration. Imagine exerting yourself to the maximum, encased in a metal oven, struggling to breathe and losing precious fluids. Many soldiers, particularly knights, were incapacitated or even died from heat stroke before ever receiving a wound. Historians still argue whether deaths from heat exhaustion in heavily armored troops were as common as deaths from direct combat wounds, but it was certainly a significant, often overlooked, battlefield hazard. Shields were another vital defensive piece. From the large kite shields of the early medieval period to the smaller, more agile bucklers and heater shields of later centuries, shields provided crucial protection for the torso and head. They could deflect blows, parry attacks, and form impenetrable shield walls when infantry stood in formation. But they also added weight and required constant effort to wield, especially in the crush of combat. The combination of armor and shield meant that medieval combat was often a contest of attrition. Breaking through an opponent's defenses required skill, strength, and exploiting any tiny opening. The sound of weapons striking armor, the clang of sword on steel, the dull thud of an axe on a helmet would be a constant, terrifying symphony on the battlefield. And while armor offered significant protection, it also meant that wounds, when they did occur, were often crushing blows, jagged cuts to exposed flesh, or piercing stabs into vulnerable points. So, As you imagine yourself struggling to breathe within a heavy helmet or feeling the weight of chainmail chafing against your skin, you realize that medieval protection was a trade-off. It offered life-saving defense but demanded immense physical endurance and came with its own set of debilitating challenges. You'd certainly appreciate your modern protective gear, or simply your unencumbered ability to move after that. From the clanking, suffocating embrace of medieval armor, your focus now shifts to the very individuals who had to wear it and direct the chaos, the role of commanders. Forget modern battle plans displayed on digital screens. Medieval commanders, from kings to dukes, were not just strategists but personal combatants leading from the front and making life or death decisions amidst the deafening roar of battle. You'd quickly realize that generalship was a far more visceral and dangerous profession. Imagine being a medieval commander on the battlefield. You would likely be positioned in a place where you could observe the battles unfolding, often on a slight rise or at the center rear of your main battle line, but crucially, still on the battlefield. You wouldn't be in a distant command tent, relaying orders via radio. Your orders would be shouted, carried by heralds, or signaled by banners and horns. This immediacy meant you were always exposed to the same dangers as your men: arrows, cavalry charges, and the thick of the infantry clash. Your primary role was to inspire your troops through your personal courage and presence. A king or noble who fought bravely alongside his men was a powerful motivator, boosting morale and encouraging fierce loyalty. This personal example was paramount. Imagine seeing your lord, shining in his armor, fighting fiercely just yards away. It would undoubtedly steal your resolve. This also meant that commanders were often among the most heavily armored and skilled warriors on the field. A mainstream historical fact is the personal leadership and direct participation of medieval commanders in battle. Unlike modern generals who often remain far from the front lines, medieval kings and nobles were expected to lead charges, fight in the melee, and be visible to their troops. This direct engagement was a hallmark of medieval warfare, creating a strong bond with their men, but also placing them in extreme danger. Many kings, like Richard III at Bosworth Field, died fighting in the thick of it. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about how commanders influenced battle: the use of personal war cries and distinctive armor. While armies had banners, individual commanders often had their own unique war cries, like St. George for England, shouted to inspire their men and identify themselves in the chaos. Their armor, too, might be distinctively gilded, painted, or adorned with crests, like the famous English Plantagenet lions, to make them easily recognizable. Imagine the roar of 1,000 men repeating their lord's battle cry, or the psychological impact of seeing a familiar, feared crest approaching through the dust. It was a blend of audible and visual branding for war. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of these distinctive elements was truly for battlefield identification, or if they were more about psychological warfare and fostering loyalty through personal iconography. Making decisions in the heat of battle was incredibly challenging. The fog of war was literal, obscured by dust, smoke, and the press of bodies. Communication was slow and unreliable. A commander had to react to unfolding events based on limited information, trusting their intuition and the reports of their immediate retainers. Sending reinforcements, redeploying troops, or initiating a retreat required split-second judgments under immense pressure. The risks were immense. Being killed, as many monarchs and great lords were, could instantly decide the fate of a battle and a kingdom. Capture was also a terrifying prospect, leading to potentially ruinous ransoms or lengthy imprisonment. Their visibility, while inspiring, also made them prime targets for enemy archers and assassins. So, as you imagine yourself encased in armor, shouting commands amidst the din of battle, trying to discern the ebb and flow of a chaotic clash, you realize that being a medieval commander was a terrifying and highly personal form of leadership. It demanded courage, tactical acumen, and a willingness to put your own life on the line every single time. You'd certainly appreciate a secure bunker and a direct comms link after that kind of leadership experience. From the personal courage and dangerous decisions of the medieval commander, your focus now shifts to the very heart and soul of their fighting force: the standards and banners. Forget mere flags. These were potent symbols. tactical markers, and rallying points that held immense psychological and spiritual power on the chaotic medieval battlefield. You'd quickly realize that losing your banner was almost as bad as losing the battle itself. Imagine standing in your battle line. Above the sea of helmets and weapons, tall poles rise, bearing brilliantly colored, often intricately embroidered, standards and banners. At the very center, perhaps, would be the King's Royal Standard, a massive, unique banner representing his personal presence and the ultimate authority of the crown. Surrounding it would be the banners of various great lords, each with their distinct heraldic devices: a lion, an eagle, a cross, representing their feudal retinues. These weren't just pretty decorations, they were vital. Tactically, banners served as crucial visual cues. In the dust, smoke, and chaos of a melee, it was incredibly difficult to tell friend from foe, or to know where your own unit was. Your banner was your landmark, your navigational point in a swirling storm of violence. You knew that as long as you could see your lord's banner, you knew where to fight, where to rally, and where to push forward. Losing sight of it could lead to disorientation and panic. A mainstream historical fact is the immense morale-boosting and rallying power of battle standards. Seeing one's own banner still flying high, especially after heavy fighting, could inspire weary troops to renewed effort. Conversely, the sight of an enemy's banner falling or being captured was a massive blow to their morale and a huge boost to the attackers, often signaling the turning point in a battle and precipitating a rout. The battle for the standard was often as fierce as the battle for the commander. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about the sacred nature of some banners, the sacred banner, or reliquary standard. Beyond secular heraldry, some medieval armies carried religious banners or standards that incorporated holy relics. These might be a piece of a saint's garment, a fragment of the true cross, or a holy image. These banners were believed to bring divine protection and favor, inspiring immense devotion and courage in the troops. Imagine fighting under a banner that you truly believe is blessed by God, making you feel invincible. It blended religious fervor with military purpose in a uniquely medieval way. Historians still argue whether the perceived spiritual power of these banners was a genuine popular belief or primarily a tool employed by clergy and commanders to galvanize troops and justify conflict. Protecting these banners was a matter of extreme honor and grave duty. Special guards, often the most loyal and seasoned veterans, would be assigned to defend the standard bearer, knowing that if the banner fell, it could signal defeat and cause a devastating rout. The standard bearer himself was a highly visible and dangerous target, a prime objective for enemy archers and knights. The loss of a standard was a deeply humiliating event, a stain on a lord's honor that could take years or even generations to live down. Conversely, capturing an enemy's standard was a tremendous victory, a tangible trophy of triumph that could be paraded triumphantly and displayed as a symbol of dominance. This made the standard bearer a central figure in the tactical and psychological warfare of the battlefield. So, as you lift your eyes above the chaos and fix them on the fluttering colors of your own banner, you realize that these seemingly simple pieces of cloth were powerful conduits of identity, loyalty, and fate. They were the silent, yet eloquent, symbols that rallied men to fight, inspired them to endure, and marked the triumphs and tragedies of medieval battle. You'd certainly appreciate the clear, concise information of a modern map and GPS after relying on something so deeply symbolic and vulnerable. From the powerful symbolism of standards and banners, your journey through the medieval battle now takes a grim, inevitable turn. The lines have broken, the formation shattered, and the will to fight has evaporated. You are witnessing the retreat and rout, a terrifying, chaotic, and often far deadlier phase of a medieval battle than the initial clash. You'd quickly realize that running away could be more dangerous than standing your ground. Imagine the moment. Your side's line begins to waver. A gap appears, then another. A panic spreads like wildfire. Suddenly, individual soldiers begin to turn, then small groups, then entire units. The cohesion built up through hours of disciplined training and brutal fighting collapses in an instant. The orderly retreat quickly devolves into a full-blown rout, a desperate, every man for himself scramble for survival. The loud, organized shouts of battle are replaced by the screams of terror, the thud of running feet, and the desperate cries for mercy. The danger during a rout was immense, often exceeding the casualties sustained during the main engagement. Pursuing cavalry would cut down fleeing infantry with ease, as heavily armored knights could swiftly overtake desperate foot soldiers. Archers might continue to rain down arrows on the disorganized mass. There was no quarter given to those who fled, as capturing a fleeing common soldier offered little in the way of ransom. The objective was simply to kill as many as possible to completely break the enemy's fighting spirit and ensure they couldn't regroup. A mainstream historical fact is that casualties in medieval battles were often significantly higher during the rout phase than during the organized fighting. Once an army broke and fled, its defensive capabilities vanished, making individual soldiers incredibly vulnerable. Commanders would often hold back reserves specifically to launch a devastating pursuit once the enemy showed signs of breaking, maximizing the enemy's losses. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about the grim reality of pursuit, the targeting of the baggage train. As an army fled its baggage train, wagons carrying supplies, tents, valuables, and often camp followers became a prime target for the victorious side. Imagine the chaos as fleeing soldiers, terrified civilians, and slow-moving wagons converged, creating a tangled, helpless mass that could be plundered with ease. It offered rich rewards for the pursuers, motivating them to chase relentlessly. Historians still argue whether the plundering of the baggage train was a purely opportunistic act or a recognized, albeit brutal, part of medieval military strategy to deny the enemy resources and demoralize them further. The terrain that might have offered a defensive advantage earlier could now become a death trap. A narrow bridge, a boggy patch of ground, or a steep hill could bottleneck fleeing soldiers, making them easy targets for slaughter. Desperation would lead men to shed their armor and weapons, anything to lighten their load and increase their chances of escape, only to leave them even more vulnerable. The psychological impact on the routed army was devastating. Humiliation, terror, and the loss of comrades would leave a lasting scar. Those who escaped might wander for days, wounded and starving, trying to find safety. For the victorious side, the rout was the true sign of triumph, a final act of dominance that transformed a hard-fought engagement into a decisive victory. So, as you feel the surge of panic and the desperate urge to flee, hearing the thundering hooves behind you, you realize that the retreat and rout of a medieval battle was a horrifying, merciless conclusion. It was a chaotic scramble for life, where the lucky few escaped, and the majority faced a brutal, indiscriminate end. You'd certainly appreciate an organized evacuation plan and safe passage after that. From the chaos and carnage of the medieval rout, your journey now shifts to the somber, unsettling quiet that descends upon the battlefield once the fighting has ceased. You are now witnessing the aftermath, wounded and dead, a grim reality that far outstripped any chivalric ideal. Forget the clean conclusions of video games. This was a landscape of suffering, plunder, and the chilling finality of death. You'd quickly realize the true gruesome cost of medieval warfare. Imagine the scene as the sun begins to set, or perhaps rises on the day after the battle. The field is no longer a strategic chessboard, but a sprawling, horrifying graveyard. Bodies lie strewn everywhere, contorted in their final agonies, stripped of armor and valuables, covered in dust, mud, and pools of dried blood. The air, once filled with the din of battle, now carries the sounds of agony, the groans of the wounded, the whimpers of dying horses, and the chilling cries of those being dispatched by the victorious side. The sights are gruesome. Wounds are horrific. Gaping axe cuts, crushing mace blows, arrows protruding from chests and limbs. Many of the wounded would be left to die slowly, succumbing to blood loss, infection, or exposure. There were no organized medical corps, no ambulances. Basic first aid might be offered by a comrade or a camp follower if you were lucky, but serious injuries were often a death sentence. A mainstream historical fact is the incredibly high fatality rate for infantry and common soldiers in medieval battles, particularly during a rout. While knights might be captured for ransom, ordinary foot soldiers were often given no quarter, resulting in a disproportionately high number of killed compared to wounded or captured once an army broke formation. Their lives were simply not considered valuable enough for capture. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about the aftermath, the plundering of the dead, and sometimes the still living. Once the battle was truly over, the victorious side, and often local peasants, would swarm the battlefield to strip the bodies of armor, weapons, and any valuables. Imagine being wounded, perhaps conscious, and having your gear systematically removed by eager scavengers who might also dispatch you if you offered resistance or seemed to be beyond saving. It was a brutal, pragmatic, and often highly organized form of battlefield cleanup and profit. Historians still argue whether this widespread plunder was primarily an economic necessity for impoverished soldiers and civilians, a traditional right of the victorious, or simply an act of barbaric opportunism. The victorious army might consolidate their position, perhaps setting up camp on the battlefield itself, surrounded by the corpses of their enemies and their own fallen comrades. Priests would likely perform mass burials, often in large, hastily dug pits, for the common dead. The bodies of important nobles might be retrieved for more formal burial, or even dismembered for heart burial, as we've explored. The psychological impact on the survivors, both victors and vanquished, would be immense. Witnessing such widespread death and suffering, participating in the brutal aftermath, would leave indelible scars. The landscape itself would be forever marked by the conflict, a silent testament to the violence that had unfolded. So, as you walk across this grim landscape, carefully stepping over bodies and listening to the mournful sounds, you realize that the immediate aftermath of a medieval battle was a horrifying epilogue. It was a place where victory was cemented by the sheer scale of death, and where the value of a human life was often shockingly low. You'd certainly appreciate the concept of a modern battlefield hospital and respectful recovery efforts after this grim scene. From the grim tableau of the battlefield aftermath, your journey through medieval warfare now culminates in a broader reflection. The ransom and capture of knights and nobles. Forget the indiscriminate slaughter of common soldiers. For the elite, being defeated on the battlefield often presented a very different, if still terrifying, prospect. The chance for lucrative capture and a return to freedom, highlighting the economic and social motivations that underpin this aspect of medieval conflict. You'd quickly realize that for some, battle was also a high-stakes business. Imagine being a knight, unhorsed and surrounded by the enemy, but still alive. Instead of an immediate brutal death, you might hear a shouted command, yield or ransom. Your value wasn't in your death, but in your capture. If you were clearly identifiable by your expensive armor, your heraldic devices, or simply by shouting your name and rank, you stood a chance of being taken prisoner. The captor, recognizing your potential value, would typically disarm you and secure you, looking forward to the substantial financial reward your freedom would command. The capture of a high-ranking noble or knight was a major prize for an individual soldier or a group of soldiers. It could elevate their status, provide them with significant wealth, and even fund their retirement. This economic incentive meant that victorious common soldiers, who might otherwise be tempted to simply kill all survivors, had a reason to spare the lives of the armored elite. It was a peculiar system, where one man's defeat was another's fortune. A mainstream historical fact is the crucial role of ransom in medieval warfare's economics. The capture of wealthy nobles and knights for ransom was a major financial driver of medieval conflicts. Kings and lords could demand enormous sums of money, lands, or political concessions for the return of high-value captives. This system encouraged combatants to take prisoners rather than simply kill them, at least among the aristocratic class, leading to a distinct two-tiered casualty system on the battlefield. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about the negotiation of ransom, the parole system. Once captured, a knight might be released on parole, an oath given on his word of honor to return to his captor by a certain date or to send his ransom money. This was a remarkable system of trust in a brutal era, relying entirely on the knight's adherence to the code of chivalry and his concern for his reputation. Imagine being allowed to go home, gather your own ransom, and then return to your captor simply because you gave your word. It highlights the peculiar honor code among the knightly class. Historians still argue whether the parole system was genuinely effective due to ingrained honor, or if it was simply a pragmatic solution for captors who lacked the resources to hold high-value prisoners indefinitely. The process of negotiating a ransom could be long and drawn out, involving families, lawyers, and even the monarch of the captive's country. It could cripple families financially, forcing them to sell lands, pawn jewels, or take on massive debts. The captive, meanwhile, might endure uncomfortable imprisonment, though usually better than a common prisoner, as their captor had an interest in keeping them alive and healthy enough to pay. For the vast majority of foot soldiers, however, capture was not an option. They had no wealth, no family who would pay for their release. Their fate, if defeated, was usually immediate death on the battlefield or, if lucky, escape and a long, dangerous journey home. This stark contrast reinforced the rigid class structure of medieval society, even in the throes of battle. So, as you watch a defeated knight being disarmed and led away, a valuable prize rather than a corpse, you realize that medieval warfare, for all its brutality, had its own peculiar logic and economics. It was a system where honor and profit often intertwined, giving a select few a chance at survival that was denied to the anonymous masses. You'd certainly appreciate the clear rules of engagement and humanitarian laws of modern conflict after seeing such a stratified system of survival. End of script. Sweet dreams.